Now, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your dedication to learning something new. I appreciate your time and your presence. Today, we're going to be talking about water. How does it affect youth? By myself, prevention educator Ruth Delpino. So I always start my presentations with who am I? Because I feel, one, it's necessary for people to know who I am, but also that when we are sort of sifting through this information, it's good to know why I'm approaching it the way that I am. So hello, everyone. My name is Ruth Delpino. I'm a prevention educator for the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I'm the Mercer County Grant Program Coordinator. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified to teach English as a foreign language, life skills training, and leadership. So that's my background. I also always start my presentations with this because I feel it's necessary for people to understand why we do the things we do and why we are sort of looking at it from that lens. So this is not to scare you. This is to inform you. This is also not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You've probably known them longer than they've known themselves. I also want to say that this is not a parenting class in that anybody that works with youth, anyone that wants to learn more about youth are welcome here in this space. If you have a grandchild, if you have a niece, a nephew, a small cousin, anything like that it's always important to know more, right? So also my perspective is shaped by my learning experiences. My approach is to look at things holistically and to sort of pick out the pieces that I think would be best in this presentation. And that leads into my next point, that this presentation is evidence informed and some evidence based. So when I say that is that evidence informed in that I take a bunch of studies, I take a bunch of things that are good information, that are good resources for people, and I compile them in this presentation and I present the information with you. Now, if evidence informed also means that is how I'm interpreting some of that evidence and how I'm interpreting some of those results. So if you are more interested to know or you think differently about something, I always leave the resources in the description below, especially if this is the YouTube page, and I send out the presentation afterwards with the resources so that you know that this is where I got this information from, this is where I'm coming from, and this is how we can sort of move forward with that information. And you can go through it with me in the recording of this presentation too. And what I mean by some evidence-based is that a lot of the programs that we do at the Mercer Council, including Too Good for Drugs, life skills, footprints, protecting you, protecting me, all those sorts of things are evidence-based in that we look at the science, we understand what it means, we compile it. There's a compiled program that we administer and we are teachers for, and then we educate upon those prefaces and upon those claims. Now, those evidence-based resources make their way into my presentations in many ways. There are many different areas in which the presentation has those sorts of things. So if you're saying, oh, that sort of looks familiar as the previous presentation, I might have pulled that from Life Skills, Too Good for Drugs, or Parents Who Host, something along those lines. Now, what I do want to talk about is, because we are talking about water, it would be best to actually discuss some facts about water. So the body is actually mostly water. And I actually was wondering about it, saying, well, how much and in what parts, and why is water so important to us? Now, in order for our body to function, I actually looked at some of the statistics of our bodies themselves. And it says here, and this is on the Journal of Biological Chemistry, they stated that the brain and heart are composed of 73% water. The lungs are about 83%. The skin contains 64%. Muscles and kidneys are 79%. And even the bones are watery, 31%. Now, for some people who may be in the medical fields or people who are really in tune with knowing these sorts of facts, may not be surprised by that. But when I first learned that, I thought that was so interesting, because what we're really talking about here and what we're really trying to understand is that every part of us in some way is touched by water, is intrinsic to water. And so I thought that was why it was so interesting for us to be talking about this today. Also, 2.1 billion people in the world do not have access to clean water. That is a scary statistic because there are about 7 billion people. No, sorry, my apologies. Maybe 5 billion, closer to 6 billion at this point in people in the world. And water regulates the Earth's temperature. Now, a lot of people may not understand what that means, but really what it is that because water is reflective and because water actually absorbs, it sort of reflects light in that way so that when sun rays come down on the Earth, it actually reflects it out, which is why the Greenland having so much ice was really important for us because it acted really as a big mirror to reflect a lot of those harsh sun rays out back into the universe outside of the Earth. And that's neither here nor there. And water also absorbs a lot of that temperature. So that's why oceans tend to be relatively warm, depending on the way that, depending on where you're looking, whether or not it's North or South poles. But yes, water does regulate the Earth's temperature because it absorbs and reflects. And also, I thought that was pretty obvious, but we're just going to put it out there anyway. It is the basis for all life on Earth. Now, this means that every organism on this planet in some way, shape, or form is dependent on water. And that means that without water, things cannot exist the same way. So we're going to sort of go through that. I do have a video that I wanted to share just because it is something that I thought was really poignant, and it leads into our next slide and also next point.
Water, would you like to get some water? Really good prices. Water? Excuse me? Are you interested in water, madam? Hi there. This is water from Somalia.
How much this one?
That one's 20 kilometers. This one that's 10 kilometers. Children in Somalia are having to walk 10 kilometers to get water, sometimes in drought up to 50 kilometers. So you need to walk 30 kilometers for this water. Are you interested?
No, no.
So are you interested? Doesn't look like I'm selling any water today. This is my first customer. Would you like to go for the 1 kilometer water?
Okay.
He's got 2 kilometers to travel. 200 meters so far. Fortunately, you haven't traveled far enough.
I'm so dying for this water. I finished. Yes!
So now you can have the water.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well done for getting it. You should always check the ingredients. Cholera,
Polio. Typhoid.
hepatitis A.
Not good.
Those are all deadly diseases.
It is dangerous.
Are you happy drinking this water?
No.
Water?
Okay, so obviously I had to talk about access to clean water when we were talking about water in general. One, because it is so important for us to know that we have a different reality than some other people in the world, but also for us to know that when we are looking at different ways of life, that we are understanding that what we have and what we don't have are relative to other people, right? So I would also say that for some people who don't know kilometers, a kilometer is about 0.6 miles. And I go from there. And so when he said they walk about 50 kilometers, if you do 66% of 50, that would be about, oh, I'm so bad with math. That would be about 30-ish miles, give or take. I hope that the math people in here aren't too mad about that really stodgy math. All right, so we're going to be moving on and moving forward. Now, there is a saying called poisoning the well. And when we're sort of looking at it, why I want to talk about this is because there are a lot of different areas of the world that focus on wells, and wells is actually a small portion of how people get their drinking water and people get their usable water. But there is quite a bit of history to poisoning the well. And I did want to talk about it because it does play a role in the way that youth interact with water today. Now, the history of the well in general and the way that people say it, the euphemism itself is really interesting in that there is sort of a literary device to poisoning the well. And this article talks about it here. So, and I'm going to start reading it now. It says, another technique by which the personality of a speaker is sometimes discredited is called poisoning the well. An enemy, when he poisons a well, ruins the water. No matter how good or how pure the water is, it is now tainted and hence unusable. Now, when we are using that analogy, it sort of means that you are, causing harm before that person actually does anything. And I found that really interesting because there is such historical context to poisoning a well, in that if you hit something at the source, meaning water, then everybody else is affected, then everything else is affected by it. Now, I also have up here, there are definitely layers to this meaning, and I also have ISIS up there. So my apologies for bringing up something that may be hard for some people to talk about, but I really think that this is something, and this is an example, a great example of why controlling water is an interesting part of the human history that we have, right? So especially ISIS. So essentially, during the time that ISIS really was a huge part of Syria and they were making their way into the rural areas, what they had essentially done was saying they wanted to recruit a lot of people. And when they wanted to recruit people, the best way that they could control this population through brute force, of course, but also through water. And what they had done was they had said, all right, you don't want to be a part of our organization, you don't want to support us, then they would pour oil into their drinking water. They would pour copious amounts of salt into their drinking water and say, well, guess what? Now you have nothing. And what I found really interesting too is that they would also block off waterways. And if they wanted to make money, they would actually sit at these waterways and charge people to give access to this drinking water. And even then, I sort of wanted to say that in the video before, they talked about drinking water, and you would walk 35 miles to find this drinking water in Somalia. And it was children that had done this. You would still be given access to a lot of things that are not necessarily good for you, like cholera, hepatitis A, and other waterborne diseases. Now, that is something interesting to think about too. But beyond that, what we are looking at here is the control of water. And I think that a lot of the time people want to know, why talk about other places when you're talking about water? Now, when we are talking about it, it's to understand that water is a universal element. It is something that every person in the world has in common, regardless of gender, race, culture, ethnicity. Everyone needs to drink water. That's just a reality. Hunger does not have a race. Hunger does not have an emotion. Hunger is the same way as water. People need both to survive. Now, when we are talking about this too, understand that in the Middle East, the reason why water is so important is because their aquifers are actually drying up. Now, if anybody doesn't know what an aquifer is, I kind of want to go over this for a second. And I have a great article here by National Geographic. I love National Geographic for a lot of reasons. Oh, it says to sign up, but I already signed up, excuse me, National Geographic. But if we can look here, just underneath, my apologies for the stodgy work here, but they have quite a few different waterways underneath here. And right here, the Arabian aquifer is the one that's drying up. And what aquifers are, and what they have been for millions and billions of years, is they are essentially filtered water that presses between the earth. And the earth naturally has a lot of different types of water, but that's because it sort of is filtering through a lot of that. So the earth in its own way finds a way to filter, to replenish, to recycle, and aquifers are just an answer to some of those processes. Now, how can this be fixed? I want to say that it is not easy, first of all, but it's a complicated answer for a lot of different reasons, because water is used in so many different ways. It is used in industries, it is used in farming, it is used in everyday life, it is used for gardening, it is used for, hydration, all of those sorts of things. And what we need to sort of wrap our minds around is that water is a finite resource, meaning there's only so much of it on this planet, and what we have is what we got. That's it. So when it is poisoned, when it is filled with oil, when it is, filtered with all of these waterborne diseases, if it has salt in it, all those sorts of things, it is not good for us. And therefore, it's not good for children. And it is not good because children need the most water because they are growing. They are trying to understand the world. Their bodies need a lot of nourishment to get through the day. Now, to also know that the way that this sort of and what we can look at and to understand is to be fixed is there's obviously a cultural expectation to certain types of water, right? So if you're talking about Middle Eastern water, that in itself has a very visceral reaction. If you're talking about Somalian water, that in itself has a visceral reaction. But in the United States, when we talk about water, sometimes we don't really think about it. And I want us to look at it and say there are parts of it that we really do need to think about. And we're going to be talking about that, I believe, in the next slide or the slide after. Now, I also want to say that infrastructure is a great part of this, and we will be touching more upon that later on in this presentation. So think of the word infrastructure, and that is one of our solutions here. Now, there is also something called the water scarcity scale, and I want to sort of talk about this because the water scarcity scale does exist. It is something that exists for long periods of time, and it actually has come more into the forefront of the international conversation, especially at the United Nations, because they have different scales for different areas, right? So South Africa actually hit 0 on the amount of water that they can actually replenish, meaning that the amount of water that they are using outweighs the amount of water that can be replenished naturally. Now, there are a lot of different ways that they can sort of look at South Africa where they have recycled their water and have actually expanded that scarcity scale to 10 more years, but they had hit 0 in 2017. So there's a lot of different areas to this that we can say that's a little scary because there are countries running out of water. And I don't know about anybody else, but when I hear that, I start to get nervous. And I'm like, what about the United States? What about where I am? What about the children here? And so we're going to look at that and we're going to understand it. Now, there is also another place that I didn't put on there, but I did want to talk about Mexico, and especially in Mexico City. We're going to specifically talk about Mexico City. And Mexico City is going to hit 0, which means they're not going to have replenished water very, very soon. I believe that their target was 2019, if I'm not mistaken, and they had expanded that, I believe, another 3 years. But when we are looking at this, it's to understand that scarcity scales are there for a reason, for us to understand how we can recycle water. And when we are recycling that water, there are many different ways that we can do that. And in Mexico City, there were experts that had found that if they replaced the leaky pipes in Mexico City, they could save 50% of the water scarcity, meaning that they could actually expand their time by 50%. So instead of 3 years where they had the scarcity, they could actually have 5.5 years. Now that may not mean a lot to certain people, or sorry, 4.5 years. That may not mean a lot to certain people, but that 1.5 years really does make a difference. So if you replace leaky pipes, if you do sorts of things like that, then we are actually looking at ways to have more of a harm reduction approach, but at least add more cushion to that scarcity. Now, also, what I do want to say is that there is violence around wells. There are many different ways that violence surrounds wells, but in its own right, wells are a source of people thriving. Water in its own right is a source of people thriving. I believe in a lot of the time in history where we sort of look at the different ways like Mesopotamia, Egypt, all of those civilizations, Rome even, all of those civilizations lasted around water because water was something people needed. It is something that people needed to survive, and there weren't systems in place for them to have access to it otherwise. Now, violence surrounding wells, we sort of already talked about this before with ISIS, but to also understand that children are the ones gathering that water. Children are almost always sent out to gather water from different places for their family because that is the task that they are given. That is the task that is easy. It is straightforward. You walk to the water, get the water, bring it home. It is not complicated. Now, this may seem easy and simple, but for a lot of reasons, it's not. One, length of time that you would have to walk, you would be missing school, things like that. But there are so many different areas to that, that's just a whole other presentation for us to look at. But there is a transaction when it comes to water, especially with people that are trying to regulate access to water because of terrorist organizations like ISIS. So that is something to understand as well. Now, why is this an issue? We sort of talked about it before, but UNHCR, the United Nations Human Rights Commission, declared access to water as a basic human right in, I believe, 1995. Water is the foundation for all life on Earth. And I also want to say that people can sort of think about water making life easier, but I don't think it makes life easier. It makes life possible in the first place. Without water, nothing would be here. Access to water also means access to drinkable, usable water, meaning that if you find water with cholera in it, it's not usable. And interdependence should and will be addressed in this presentation as well. So when you have interdependence, there is a line to say that, yes, Somalia may be suffering, but how can we help? Well, there are a lot of different ways that we can, and we'll be getting into that. Now, the next slide is actually talking about the importance of, I sort of out of order here, but the importance of hydration in addiction recovery. So we're going to be shifting gears just for a second, because I know that we're prevention education, but water exists in all facets of the recovery process and all facets of the substance use disorders that people experience. Now, I also want to preface with saying substance use disorders are not addiction, but addiction is a substance use disorder. Addiction is the end point of a substance use disorder, not the other way around. So it's sort of like a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. Now, this is a harm reduction process, and the harm reduction is great in that 75% of a child's body is made up of water. So that 75% is really important, especially with a child that is in recovery in some way. 70% of adults is water. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, saunas are a great way for people to use their hydration or water to help them in the detoxification process, because it does help with flushing out drugs and medications and anything that may have interfered with their recovery process. So that is something to keep in mind as well. Also, I did want to sort of touch upon quickly that I don't know if anybody has the Odyssey online, but there is a great article here that basically talks about the addiction to dehydration. And when we're sort of talking about the hustle, we're sort of talking about making money, we're sort of talking about staying up late, doing those sorts of things. What we will find is Generation Z will stay up late. They will drink coffee. They will, especially cold brew. Generation Z loves cold brew. And so there will be a lot of ways that children especially will find to stay dehydrated, which is not good for them by any means, but it is something that happens, and it is something for us to keep and to be aware of. So I also do want to say that when people are in recovery, sometimes people do not drink correctly. They don't take care of their bodies the right way. So when you're trying to find a baseline for recovery, drinking as much water as you can help with that process. Now, I'm going to be going back for a second and sort of going back to what could be in the water, is that there are drugs in our drinking water. And in case anybody was wondering about it, this article has a wonderful sort of it's WebMD, but it has questions, answers. So if you're like, oh, what is it in the public water supply? What are the health effects to this? Let's say pregnant women, what happens to them? All that stuff, right? So we know, for example, that when we are looking through this, they talked a lot about the different ways that your body could be affected by drinking water. But the thing is that this phenomenon is not new, but it is something that hasn't been studied very long. So I sort of want to start that conversation with this video.
Ready to be scared? Even if you run your water through the most filtery of filters, it will still have chemicals in it from discarded prescription drugs. You have 6 seconds to freak out. Go. Hey peeps, Trace here for D News. Prescription drugs are showing up in lakes and rivers and streams, and some of that water will make its way, inevitably, into our bodies. These drugs get there because we humans are not so awesome at taking care of prescription chemicals. We either excrete them through our bodily waste, which I know we can't really help that much, or some people are still flushing drugs down the toilet. It's not like they just disappear. How are these drugs getting there, and what can they really do? A report by the Royal Society of Chemistry admits that once a concentration reaches a certain level, around 1 part per million, the chemicals can begin to affect the environment. They also admit that these drugs have been running into the groundwater since the 1990s, as most water treatment systems aren't really designed to screen out active ingredients like hormones or small molecules. The FDA and the EPA found that many urban and rural sources of groundwater, while clean and pure enough to drink, contain trace amounts of ingredients from birth control pills, antidepressants, painkillers, shampoos, anti-epileptics, and other pharmaceutical products, including caffeine. And worse, these drugs were beginning to affect the wildlife as well. Researchers at the U.S. Geological Survey discovered intersex fish in the Potomac River back in 2006, probably due to estrogen contamination. The USGS went on to admit that 80% of streams in Iowa were contaminated with everything from cholesterol medication to steroids. And on top of that, researchers in the UK found fish with deformed sex organs downstream from drug manufacturing plants. And if rivers continue increasing in contaminants like hormones, the chemical compounds will cut photosynthesis in algae, plants, and underwater fungi by 99%. And then the fish will eat those biofilms and suffer as well. Now comes the fun part. What happens when we eat these estrogenic-riddled fish or drink the anti-anxiety-filled water that filters through aquifers below stream beds and into our houses? We don't know yet. Humans are pretty good at resisting such small amounts of drugs, and so far, they've only affected small animals, tiny plants, and the like. But if we don't do something soon, the problem is only going to get worse. One way to help is simply follow the rules. The FDA explains proper disposal of pharmaceutical drugs, so always follow those guidelines. And be sure you dispose of prescription medications properly. We can't help excreting them as waste. Really, we can't. It's going to happen. But we can properly dispose of expired pills. Do you think maybe over-medication is the problem? What creative solutions can you come up with to keep this crap out of the water? Transcribe your thoughts in the comments or send us a tweet at DNews. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone.
Okay, so I love this YouTube channel for a lot of different reasons. One, they're fast talking, so there's a lot of information that comes at you quickly, but in a way, they make it very digestible. They break things down, and it's not hard to just watch a video, right? So when we're talking about how to keep drugs out of the water, what he said basically is very simple. Education on proper disposal is really important, but why is it important? Well, he sort of said it already, that the environment itself is affected by the way drugs make their way into our drinking water. Now, that also means that when we need to keep drugs out of our drinking water, there are many different disposal boxes that people can use. And the Mercer Council actually has a list of disposal boxes in case you're wondering for Mercer County. But if you're wondering for your county, they are available on the county website, regardless of what you're looking at, right? So this is all the different places. And we also hyperlink them so you can click on whatever you need to. So we can click on Ewing, and then it shows you the Ewing Police Department, and you can look through and find their location and drop off your medicine. There have been times where I've also taken people's medicine and dropped it off myself because they didn't have the time, or they were just wondering where to put it. So we have taken it before and then dropped it off for them. This is really important for us to understand, that drugs cannot stay out of the water because it is something that just naturally happens, because people may not know what to do with their pills, but people also may not be really good at keeping their pills in safe places. So things happen, they land on the ground, things like that. But it's not also that people are flushing it down their toilets too. So that's something to keep in mind, that it's not just prescription drugs, but they have found prescription drugs are definitely a part of it. But also know that when drugs in general are not properly disposed of, they do find their way into the water sources through runoff from rain and other things like that. So when someone drops cigarette butts, or someone drops unused heroin bags, those sorts of things make their way into the water, which then affects how people digest certain things, and also affects the environment itself. And I found one fact that was really interesting on the video, where the individual had said that when they have certain pills in, or the water has certain amounts of estrogen in it, it actually gets rid of 99% of the plankton that are supposed to be filtering through stuff. So I also thought that interesting because I was like, that's a lot. That's 99%. I think that, you know, fish need that. I think the environment needs 99% of whatever's taken away from it. So these are the sorts of things that as adults, as people who understand this process, can teach children to help to properly dispose of things, to help properly see things and say things and understand what that process looks like. Now, we're going to be talking next about lead pipes. And I do want to preface with saying that lead pipes in general have been something that have come up quite a lot, especially with the rise of Flint, Michigan. There are so many different ways that we can look at this, but also I do want to say that Flint, Michigan definitely was a place that, and is a place that needs drinkable water, that needs, you know, access to clean, good water. But when we are talking about it too, understand that there are other cities in the United States that are worse than Flint, Michigan. There are other cities in New Jersey that are worse than Flint, Michigan. So this is something to keep in mind as well. All right, so we're going to be moving forward and moving onward. So lead in the water, why does this happen? Well, there are a lot of different reasons why lead in the water happens. There may be runoff from drugs, there may be runoff from improper disposal of paints, of metals, of certain things that just sort of erode over time and make their way into the water streams. But this does happen for a lot of different reasons. And this may happen more specifically because of the environmental protection regulations that people don't follow. So they may not dispose of things correctly and it makes their way into the water. But also piping is a huge part of that. And what I mean by that is piping, depending on where it is and what we're talking about here, may also cause erosion over time and lead into people's drinking water. So itself, the water may be good, but it may be contaminated through going through pipes that lead into people's homes. So we're going to be discussing that in the next couple of minutes. Now, there are a couple of side effects, I say a couple, but I really do mean a lot when we're talking about it. So symptoms include a lot of different things, but for children, in general, there is, and for people in general, there is stomach pain, headaches, vomiting, confusion, muscle weakness, seizures, hair loss, anemia, which is a low blood cell count. Long-term exposure to lead poisoning can also damage your brain, kidneys, bone marrow. And bone marrow is a soft tissue inside bones. So everyone needs bone marrow, just putting that out there. Everyone needs bone marrow. So if that is something that is affected, then we are really in trouble. Now, Trenton lead levels. There was a study that was done in 2018, and this was done by Trenton Waterworks. And people are wondering what happened, right? What was the conclusion for this? And they did a study from July 2018 to December 2018, and they had conducted routine water samples testing for lead. Now, the lead levels at customers' taps in the distribution system exceed the lead action level of 15 parts per billion for the 90th percentile, meaning that they are in the highest part of the percentile. So let's say if someone says the 95th percentile, that means there's only 5% more cities in the United States that has higher lead levels. So the 90th percentile, that means there's only 10% more lead levels in the United States that are higher. So that is not good for a lot of different reasons. And this is, and for the samples based on samples of water in homes and lead service lines and or copper piping with lead solder, water from 11 out of 105 homes sampled. So this is 11 out of 105, that's about 10%, contained lead levels above the action level. So the action level is 15 parts per billion. But what people and a lot of experts are arguing is that lead levels in general, lead in the water at all, is bad. That just holistically, scientists and doctors and healthcare workers agree alike that lead in water in any capacity is bad. And I'm going to be reading some of the side effects of low level lead exposure. So I read high level lead exposure before, but we're going to be talking about in children specifically. Now, lead levels for the blood levels of lead in the blood of children can result in the following: behavior and learning problems, lower IQ and hyperactivity, slowed growth, hearing problems, and anemia. Now, when we are talking about the side effects of low level lead poisoning, this is the stuff that is not actionable, meaning it is not something that the city or anyone has to take care of, meaning that people are going to keep digesting it and keep using it and keep using the water and keep, engaging with the water systems because they have to, because they're humans, because every life needs water. And if there is no action on these low level lead systems, that means that these people and this youth and these youths will have to live with these side effects forever without any policy or government mitigation. Now, this can be hard for a lot of reasons, because when you are looking at learning and you are looking at classroom settings and you are looking at the future of youth, this in itself is a very disenfranchising process, because we find that urban areas are more likely to have less infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I really do mean replacing lead pipes, making sure that water stays in certain areas, it contains different parts of the water. Now, I also have here Aquasana, which is a great resource for just looking at water issues in general. They said US cities with high lead levels, and these are like one of the highest in the United States. Now, we have here Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Phoenix, Baltimore, San Antonio, and this is because of the infrastructure, and they do give reasons here. So for Milwaukee, they say half of their water mains were installed before 1954. That's an issue. Replacing that would be really important. Philadelphia, half of Philadelphia's water mains were installed before 1930. Some pipes are still in use today, predating the Civil War. Now, that is something really important to recognize. Also in Phoenix, it says Phoenix ramped up its water main replacement program in the 2000s, which helped cut water main breaks by 40%. Now, water main breaks meaning that water pipes just sort of burst and that drinkable water just goes everywhere and gets contaminated when people try to clean it up or filters through the aquifers again. In San Antonio, Texas, they say water pipes are relatively young. Half were installed after 1985, which is good, but there are still some piping issues there. The average age of water mains in Baltimore is 75 years. Now, there is an article here that I had looked at and that I sort of wanted to discuss, was that what is New Jersey doing? What is New Jersey doing that sort of would help this process, right? And what we want to know too is that it takes, and pipes in general only should have a life expectancy of about 30 to 40 years, meaning anything above 40 years, you're at risk of putting lead in the water due to erosion. Now, this is harmful for a lot of reasons, but that is something to recognize and to know. So, I also wanted to talk about low lead levels in pregnant women just for a second, because I did want to say that it still does affect children. And it says reduced growth of the fetus and premature birth. So when you are an infant and you are born prematurely, it can affect and have health issues later on in your life. So here, there are frequently asked questions about water levels and lead in the drinking water. Now, there are quite a few different areas that there were issued and that we were talking about for New Jersey, but I think that when we're looking at this, they are saying, how can you do periodic testing, the lead levels in the water? Water is a utility. So they sort of talk about going through the process of that and what the government officials need to do to test the pH of the water, and what steps you can do to minimize the presence of lead in your drinking water, and what New Jersey has been doing. Now, there is an article that I had looked at here that I believe it was this one. Give me a second. Oh, no, this is the lead in your drinking water for Trenton specifically, but this is a great article because they also talked about quite a few different things here. So, and you can also have your number here. They have their number here. So in case you were wondering about any of these sorts of things, you can reach out to them for that. Now, in New Jersey itself, the estimation to replace all of the bad pipes in New Jersey would cost about, I believe it said about $5 billion. Now, $5 billion is a lot, and I may be getting the numbers a little mixed up. So I will have the resource below just in case you're wondering to get the really significant numbers. But $5 billion is a lot. And New Jersey has just been given an infrastructure bill, and they will only be spending $50 million to replace pipes in New Jersey. Now that is concerning for a lot of reasons, because we don't have the money to replace the pipes that may contain lead. But we also need to know that it is a start. It is something that is being done, and it is something that is a priority for New Jersey, according to the article that I looked at. Also, to understand that Trenton, when they had tested for lead, there were different points between 2010 and 2018 that they tested higher than Flint, Michigan for lead in their water. So that is something to keep in mind, and that is something to know. So a lot of people may ask, how can we help? There are a lot of different ways you can help. There's a lot of different ways that you can look through infrastructure. And I think the best way, as a person who is in charge of children, as a person who affects children's lives, who is the person that takes care of children until they're adults, hold leaders accountable. If they say they're going to be working on infrastructure bills, if they're going to be talking about policy, if they're going to be talking about budgets, hold leaders accountable. Vote people in that will do what they say. Be aware of the events in the world and in your community. As I said before, wells and access to water really do impact the way that children interact with their environment. It affects their school attendance. It affects their own public and personal safety. There are a lot of different ways that the world is affected by access to water. And now a lot of people are fighting over access to that water in a lot of different ways. So that is something to keep in mind. And that is something to wonder about moving forward. I would also say that if you're worried about lead poisoning, if you're worried about any sort of thing affecting children, monitor youth behavior. What are they doing? What are they looking like? What are they interacting with? How are you checking in? Also, I have here a link, but I will click on that later. Educate yourself and others, making sure that anything about water, testing your pH consistently, testing lead consistently, educating yourself and understanding the history of your area and how old the pipes are in your area and what the access to water looks like in your area. Those are all sorts of things that will affect youth. So keep that in mind. Also, show appreciation for the access we do have. I know a lot of the time people, take water for granted because it isn't something that people have to think about, but it is something other people do have to think about. You turn on your faucet and all of a sudden water pops out. There's not really a debate on how people can, have tap water. That's not something like that, but the quality of the water is important, the access to water is important, and making sure that even if people do have access to water, there may be times where they can't pay the water bill and the water is shut off. And that's something to keep in mind too. And that will be another presentation. We will touch more upon that in another presentation, but just to keep that in mind. Also, be the example. Reuse water, drink water daily, check lead levels consistently, meaning you can go to a lot of different places to check your lead levels. I myself actually go to the town center. You can ask the bureau nurse or any other person that is an assistant at that place. And you can say, hey, I would like to test my lead levels. They give you a kit. You take your water, you put it in the little container, and you send it off to get tested, and you get mailed the results back. So that is something that if you are concerned about, there are ways to check it. I would also say that water is so intrinsic to children, and I just wanted to show water and children. I just typed that in onto YouTube, and there are so many different ways that children are affected by water. There are ways that there global water crisis, finding clean drinking water, water parks for kids, water therapy, I believe was on here too, water therapy for people on the autism spectrum disorder. There are just cute videos on babies playing with water. There are so many different ways that water affects children and the way that they interact with their environment. And I just think that it's really important for us to recognize some of those ways. All right, so we'll be moving on and moving forth, and we are at the end of our presentation, but I also want to say that I always end my presentation with quotes, just because we want to know that sometimes people say it better than I can, and people use the words best in the best way, in the best form, and I may not be able to. So I do want to say, thousands have lived without love, not one without water. And this is by W.H. Auden. He, I believe, is a author for nonfiction novels. So I also think that's really important. Obviously, love is a huge part of growing up and understanding your environment and understanding how you can do better and be better and have a well full of knowledge. But there is no one and no thing that can last without water. Also, if there is, I also like this, that if there is magic on this planet, it is contained in water. And what I find so interesting about that is that water has such an ability to do so many things for us. It helps us farm, it helps us drink, it keeps us hydrated, it cleans our skin, it's part of, you know, our self-care process. There are so many different ways that water affects us. It is in our drinks. Even if people are only drinking soda, water is involved. You know, it's not one. Water is the only thing that is the baseline for everything. So it is the miracle that makes life possible. And I think that if we are mindful of how we treat water, we are mindful of how water is given to other people around the world, then we can become better, we can do better, and we can help the youth in our lives flourish more if we understand the role of water in their lives. Also know that it can be discussed in many different ways, but there are ramifications to everything. So if we know there's one population that is not be given access to water or is not be given access to the right water, then we need to do something about it. And our youth are our future, and they are the ones that give us hope in the next generation and give us hope in what this new government and this new world will look like. So let's just make sure that we take care of them in the process. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your time and dedication. I appreciate you wanting to learn something new. Next week, we will be talking about International Overdose Awareness Day. Overdoses, how do they affect youth? So hope to see you there. Thank you, and see you next week.